My father didn't slam his hand on the table. He never needed to. He simply set down his fork, looked at me across 40 years of Thanksgiving dinners and said, "You're not welcome in this house anymore." 22 relatives sat frozen with their forks halfway to their mouths. My Aunt Diane kept passing the cranberry sauce like nothing had happened. My brother stared at his plate. Nobody said my name. I stood up slowly, folded my napkin the way my mother taught me, and walked out into a cold Vermont evening without a coat. But here's what none of them knew standing in that dining room. A black sedan was already parked 3 houses down the street. Engine running, waiting for exactly this moment. And the man inside it had been holding a secret for 6 years. One my father had no idea was about to detonate his entire kingdom. Welcome to Calm Drama Vault, where we tell you the family stories that don't end in shouting. They end in silence. And silence is the loudest sound there is. I'm Claire. I'm 36. I run physical therapy clinics across 2 counties. And this is the story of how one dinner ended my father's 40-year reign over a family business he never actually owned. If stories like this one find you where you are tonight, stay until the end, because this one has a turn you will not see coming. And don't forget to subscribe, because there's always another quiet daughter with a story like mine. The sedan pulled up beside me on the sidewalk before I'd even reached my car. The window rolled down and I saw a face I hadn't seen in 6 years. Harold Weiss, my mother's college friend, her lawyer, the man who used to send me birthday cards signed Uncle Harold. Even though we weren't related by blood, he didn't ask if I was okay. He just said, "Get in, Claire. We need to talk before your father figures out what tonight actually was." I got in. My hands were still shaking from the dining room. Harold didn't drive far. Just to a diner 2 towns over, one my father would never think to look for me in. He ordered coffee for both of us before he said another word, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm in a way that scared me more than shouting would have. "Your mother knew this exact night was coming," he said. "She planned for it. Everything that happens next was already decided 5 years ago. In a hospital room your father never fully understood. I need to take you back, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. My father, Richard Bennett, built Bennett Marine into the largest boatyard operation on the Vermont side of Lake Champlain. 3 locations, 40 employees, a name people trusted with their boats and their money. He ran it the way his own father ran a hardware store before him, with one voice at the top, and everyone else falling in line beneath it. My father decided who worked which dock. He decided who got promoted and who got quietly pushed out. He decided whose name got mentioned at company parties and whose name got left off the list entirely. And at home, the rules were the same. My father decided who sat where at dinner, who got the good seat, who got interrupted, and who got believed. My mother, Eleanor, moved through that house, like she was trying not to disturb the furniture. She kept a small garden behind the kitchen that my father called a waste of good yard space, and every spring it came in so full you could smell it from the driveway. She never argued with him in front of us. I used to think that meant she'd given up. I was wrong about that in a way it would take me years to understand. The first real crack came the year I was finishing graduate school in physical therapy. I told my father I was taking a job 2 states away, instead of coming back to work in the family office like he'd always assumed I would. He didn't yell. My father never yelled. He just looked at me the way you'd look at a bad investment and said, "People who leave this family come back needing something eventually." Then he stopped paying my phone bill as what he called a lesson in independence. I went anyway. I worked nights at a clinic, took extra shifts, and built my own career from nothing, which in my father's mental ledger was somehow the worst possible outcome. Because a debt he couldn't hold over me was a daughter he couldn't control. My brother Mark stayed. He did everything according to the family code. He worked the docks, learned the business from the ground up, married a woman from a good local family, and moved into managing the second location exactly the way my father wanted. At every holiday, my father served Mark first. I got served somewhere around 4th or 5th, usually after some comment about my city job. And still, I came home for every holiday. Every single one for years, because some part of me kept believing that eventually the ledger would balance in my favor if I Just stayed patient enough. My mother walked me to my car every time I left. She'd press something small into my hand. A cutting from her garden. A folded $20 bill, once an old photograph of the two of us at the lake. She'd say the same thing every time. Grow where you're planted, Claire, even if it's somewhere new. It took me most of my adult life to understand that sentence wasn't comfort. It was instruction. The real turn came 7 years ago, in October, when I was 29. My mother called me at work, apologizing for interrupting my shift, to tell me she'd been diagnosed with early-stage ovarian cancer. Within a week, I'd rearranged my entire caseload so I could drive up every weekend. Within 2 weeks, I learned exactly how my father intended to handle his wife's cancer. He handled it the same way he handled the boatyard. He put the appointment calendar on his own desk. He drove her to every consultation and sat through every single meeting with the oncologist himself. And when her doctor in Burlington recommended getting a second opinion at a larger hospital in Boston, my father thanked the man politely, walked my mother out to the truck, and told her on the drive home that they weren't going to go shopping around for a different diagnosis like it was a used engine part. I found out about the canceled Boston appointment the way I found out about most things in that house from my mother herself, said quietly, almost like a confession. While she washed dishes and I dried them. So I acted. I want that clearly on the record, because in my family's version of this story, I'm often described as someone who appeared out of nowhere with an agenda. I called Boston myself. I got her an appointment within 11 days. I told my mother in person and offered to drive her myself. She looked toward the kitchen doorway for a long moment, like she was checking whether anyone could hear her, and then she said yes. She wanted to go. 2 days before that appointment, it disappeared. Canceled by phone. The hospital told me later it was canceled by her husband, who explained that his wife was already receiving excellent care closer to home. When I confronted my father about it, he took off his reading glasses, looked at me with something close to patience, and said the sentence that still wakes me up some nights. You've been gone too long, Claire. You've forgotten how this family handles things. For 2 years, my mother handled things, which is the polite way of describing what actually happened. Treatment bought time, and then it stopped buying time. And by the spring she turned 59, the conversations had shifted from fighting the disease to negotiating with it. I've worked with enough families as a physical therapist, enough hospice transitions, enough end-of-life care, that I recognized that shift the moment it happened. And I can tell you exactly what a good ending looks like. Pain properly managed, questions answered honestly, the patient still making their own decisions for as long as they're able to make them. My mother had none of that. My father rationed her pain medication against a calendar he kept in his head, because he'd read somewhere that people become dependent. He moved her bed down to the den so she wouldn't, in his words, wear herself out, climbing the stairs. The word hospice came up once in her doctor's office, and my father shut that conversation down the way he shut down every conversation he didn't want to have. We take care of our own, he said. That was his phrase for it. Taking care of our own. I would drive up every Sunday night with my hands actually shaking on the steering wheel, cataloging everything wrong the way any trained nurse or therapist would. The untouched pain log. The pressure sore risk from not being repositioned enough. The weight coming off her frame week by week. And every Monday when I called to check in, I get the same managed answer. She's comfortable. She ate a little today. Don't stir her up, Claire. My mother would take the phone last in those calls, and her voice got smaller every single week. And one Sunday evening in October, sitting beside her bed in the den, she held my hand and whispered the only direct request she made of me in her entire life. I don't want to do the last part his way. So I stopped asking my father's permission for anything. People imagine standing up to a man like my father looks like some dramatic confrontation. It looks like paperwork. I called her oncologist directly and explained plainly what her days actually looked like at home. He told me exactly what I already suspected, that hospice care was overdue, and that the only signature legally required to authorize it was the patient's own. Not her husband's. Hers. That distinction became the hinge my entire adult life turned on. I brought a hospice intake nurse out on a Tuesday morning while my father was at the marina, and my mother signed her own name on her own kitchen table. When my father came home that evening, there was a hospital bed being set up in the den. A proper morphine schedule taped inside the medicine cabinet, and a stranger in scrubs politely asking him to keep his voice down in his own house. He never forgave any of us for that. But here is what those final 6 weeks bought her, and I will defend that decision until the day I die. My mother slept without gritting her teeth in pain. She had clear, lucid mornings where she could hold a coffee cup with warm hands and actually talk with me. And more than once, I passed by the den doorway and saw her going through papers spread across her blanket with a fountain pen in her hand, moving slow and deliberate. I assumed it was funeral planning. I let her have her privacy. On a Thursday morning just before dawn in November, my mother died holding my hand, while my father slept upstairs because he'd decided sitting up all night in the den wasn't necessary. The funeral reception was held at the family house. 20 or so relatives balancing plates of casserole on their knees in the living room. I was in the kitchen washing serving dishes when the room behind me went quiet. And I turned around to find my father standing in the doorway with most of the family arranged behind him like a jury that had already reached its verdict. He had a speech. My father always had a speech even then. He said I had gone behind his back in his own house. He said I had filled his wife's last weeks with strangers and medication. He said a daughter capable of doing that to her own father had already left the family in every way that mattered. She simply hadn't had the decency to say so out loud. Then he said it flatly, like reading a number off a balance sheet. You're dead to this family. Claire. I stood there holding a dish towel and looked past him at each face in that room, one at a time. My aunts studied the carpet. Mark stared out the window. And I put the towel down folded neatly because my mother had raised me to leave a kitchen properly. And I drove 3 hours home with the radio off. Somewhere on the interstate that night, I understood something clearly. You cannot argue your way back onto a list one man keeps in pencil. My mother had known this exact scene was coming. I would only learn much later just how thoroughly she'd already answered it. For 6 years after that funeral, I built a life defined by distance and by work. I took on more clinical hours than anyone else at my practice. The difficult long-term rehabilitation cases nobody else wanted. Elderly patients whose families had scattered across the country and called only on birthdays. I got a quiet reputation. Call Claire. She doesn't give up on the hard ones. My supervisor once told me I overfunctioned like it was a compliment. And I took it as one, which tells you exactly how far I still was from actually leaving that family behind. Emotionally speaking. Every October, around my mother's birthday, I wrote a letter to my Aunt Diane's mother, my grandmother, Ruth, who still lived in the small cottage behind the main family property. I kept the letters light. The garden's doing well this year. I planted some of Mom's flowers by my porch and they took root. I'm doing fine, Grandma. I'm fine. I'm fine. 6 years, 6 letters, and not a single answer ever came back. I told myself she was old. That my father had painted some unflattering version of events for her. That it was probably kinder to just stop expecting a reply. But I never actually stopped writing them, and it took me the length of this whole experience to understand why. Some part of me was still quietly paying rent on a family membership that had already been formally revoked. Which brings me to that Thanksgiving dinner. And to the black sedan waiting outside with Harold Weiss behind the wheel. Sitting across from him in that diner, coffee going cold between us. Harold finally opened a plain folder he'd been resting his hand on the entire time. Your mother left me a list of things to do, Claire, he said. 7 items. What happened tonight at that dinner table was item 6. Today, right now, is item 7. Explaining all of it to the one person she actually wanted to understand. I asked him what item 6 had actually been. Because from where I was sitting, item 6 had just looked like my father throwing me out of the house. Item 6, Harold said. Was your father doing exactly what your mother predicted he would eventually do again? Weaponize this family publicly against one of his own children. She built something specifically to trigger the moment he did that. He slid the folder across the table. Inside were 3 documents. A deed history for the boatyard property. a trust instrument thick as a small book, and a single handwritten page in my mother's careful, looping handwriting. Here's what I learned sitting in that diner booth, and I want you to sit with this the way I had to. The land underneath Bennett Marine. All 3 locations. The docks, the main office building, the workshop, even the house I grew up in. None of it had ever legally belonged to my father. It had come down through my mother's side of the family, inherited from her own father decades before I was born. My mother had never once, in 38 years of marriage, put my father's name on any of it. He ran the business. He made every decision. He pointed people toward the door like a king surveying his land. And on paper, the entire time, he had been a tenant, 8 months before she died. During those quiet afternoons in the den with the door shut and the fountain pen out, my mother had moved every piece of that property into something called the Bennett Family Trust, an irrevocable trust with exactly one trustee. The man sitting across from me, stirring sugar into his coffee. I sat back in that booth feeling like the floor had tilted slightly. Outside the window, a truck rolled through the intersection, and I remember thinking absurdly that the driver had no idea an entire county's understanding of my family had just quietly shifted underneath him. "He knows," Harold said, watching me work through the arithmetic in real time. "He's known since roughly a month after your mother's funeral." Certified letter, my law firm's letterhead, the whole formal notification the law requires. He consulted a lawyer of his own back then, quietly. That lawyer read the trust instrument and told him exactly what mine could have told him for free. Your mother built it clean. Her inheritance, in her name alone, moved into an irrevocable trust while she was of fully sound mind, with a doctor's note and 2 independent witnesses. Contest that in court, and you'll spend a small fortune to lose publicly. So why did he stay so calm about it for 6 years? I asked. Because the arrangement was mercy, Harold said. The trust leased the entire operation back to Bennett Marine at a rate I describe, professionally, as roughly the cost of a decent used truck, annually. As long as your father behaved himself, that family meeting where he'd have to explain to Mark and everyone else why the Bennett name was on land it never actually owned never had to happen. Behaved how? I asked. Harold looked at me over his glasses. Your mother wrote that condition herself. You'll read it in her own words when the time is right. For now, there's someone you need to go see. Today's task has more than one part, Claire. And your grandmother Ruth is most of it. Getting to my grandmother without setting off alarms across the entire property took real coordination, which tells you plenty about how affection actually functioned in my family. My cousin Kayla ran the logistics by text from her own kitchen. My father left for the marina office every weekday morning around 8 and rarely returned before early afternoon. Mark would be out at the second location most of the day. Kayla would meet me at the tree line behind the cottage and walk me in herself. She hugged me hard in that clearing, the first time anyone in my family had actually touched me in 6 years. Then she held me at arm's length and said, "It's not good in there, Claire." I've been saying that for over a year and everyone just looks at me like I've insulted the weather. We walked the back path together, staying behind the row of pines that hid us from the main house. And when we came around the last bend and I got my first real look at my grandmother's cottage in 6 years, I stopped walking completely. Paint was peeling off the porch, railing in long curling strips. A gutter hung loose by a single bracket. The grass had grown up past my ankles in what used to be a neat row of tomato plants. And through the screen door, from somewhere inside, came a smell I recognized instantly from my clinical work, the particular smell of a home nobody has been properly cleaning. Because nobody has been properly coming. My grandmother was sitting in her front room in an old wing chair. And my first look at her hit me 2 ways at once. As a granddaughter and as a healthcare professional. And both parts of me wanted to sit down on the floor. Ruth had always been a small, sharp, quick-moving woman, the kind who beat you to the kettle before you'd even finished asking. The woman in that chair had hollows under her cheekbones I could have measured with a ruler. Her cardigan hung off her shoulders like it belonged to someone twice her size. A bruise, gone yellow-green with age, ran up her left forearm in a pattern I recognized immediately as a fall against something with an edge. And on the side table beside her sat the saddest collection of pill bottles. I'd seen outside of a clinical intake, clustered together with no organizer. No written schedule. Two of them from entirely different pharmacies. She looked at me for a long moment when I walked in, working through faces the way the very elderly often do, patient as flipping through an old card catalog. Then she found mine. "Eleanor's girl," she said, and her chin started to tremble. "Clear." I knelt beside her chair and took her hands in mine, and they felt like bird bones wrapped in paper. She gripped me back harder than I would have thought she still could. And then she said the thing that completely rearranged my understanding of the last 6 years. "They told me you stopped writing." "Sweetheart," she said, soft as worn flannel. "All these years. Why did you stop writing to me?" Behind me, Kayla went very still in the doorway. I kept my voice level. "Grandma, I never stopped." "Not once." My grandmother looked at me and then slowly, terribly at a small metal tin sitting on the mantel. She had Kayla take it down and set it in my lap. "Open it," she said. Inside, bundled together with rubber bands, were dozens of letters, sealed, stamped, addressed in my careful handwriting to Ruth Bennett at her cottage address. Every single one, unopened. "I gave them to your father to mail whenever he brought my groceries," Ruth said. "He'd tuck them right in his shirt pocket and pat it just like that. And I'd ask him, 'Any word from Claire?' And he'd get that sorrowful look and say, 'No, mother, she's moved on.' City people do that." I sat there holding 6 years of intercepted love in both hands. He hadn't even thrown them away. That detail is the one I still can't get past. He'd kept collecting them, like rent, somewhere between his shirt pocket and the mailbox at the end of the driveway. My grandmother and I had both been taught the exact same lie about each other. She doesn't answer. She's given up on you. A wall built entirely out of two people's silence, each one quietly grieving the other from 100 yards apart. Then gravel crunched in the driveway out front. A vehicle approaching, too early to be my father. It wasn't my father. Through the curtain I watched Mark's truck roll to a stop beside the porch. My brother back early with some equipment as his cover story. I had maybe 2 minutes, and I spent them the way any nurse spends an emergency window, efficiently. I photographed the bruise on Ruth's arm with her clear verbal permission. I photographed all 9 pill bottles and read every label. And my training put its cold hand flat on my back the moment I saw one particular name, warfarin. My grandmother was on a blood thinner. The kind of medication that requires strict monitoring. A proper dosing schedule, regular blood tests. Doubled bottles from 2 different pharmacies. A documented fall risk on a drug where a single fall could mean internal bleeding. Nobody would catch in time. Boots hit the porch steps. I put my phone away and stood between my grandmother and the door out of pure instinct. Mark filled the doorway the way our father often did. And for one brief second his face was genuinely glad to see me. Then he remembered whose son he was. He didn't throw me out. I want to be fair to my brother because this story isn't entirely fair to him elsewhere. He sat down heavily on the ottoman and rubbed his face with both hands like a man finishing a very long day that was only half over. "You shouldn't be here, Claire," he said quietly. I told him our grandmother needed a doctor and a proper medication review. And that he already knew it. "I know she's old," he said. "Old isn't a crime." I asked him when Ruth had last actually left this cottage for anything. He didn't answer that one. "Dad's rattled," Mark finally said. "That car showing up. Whatever's happening with the lawyers. He's been on the phone since this morning. You being here today just adds gasoline. You understand what I'm telling you?" And then my brother said the quiet part out loud. The part that told me he'd known the stakes involved all along. "Last time we lost you," he said. "This time it'll be Grandma. He'll shut this whole house down like a fist, and no one from the county will ever get it back open. And you know him, Claire, so you know I'm right." He stood up. Message delivered. At the door, without turning around, he added, "There's another family meeting coming. Whatever your lawyer friend thinks she's doing, Dad doesn't lose on his own land." His own land? Even then, even already knowing otherwise, I drove home that evening with the tin of letters sitting on my passenger seat, because Ruth had pressed it into my hands. "They're yours," she'd said. They were always yours. Somewhere past the county line. I pulled into a gas station and sat under the fluorescent lights and made a call I'd been circling around all afternoon. Not a report yet. Just a state line where you can describe a situation without names and ask what it actually adds up to. I laid it out clinically. An elderly woman living alone in a failing home. Unmonitored blood thinner medication in duplicate bottles, an untreated injury, recent falls. And a family actively controlling her doctor visits, her pharmacy, and her mail. The woman on the line asked if I was a mandated reporter, and told me plainly that what I'd just described wasn't a gray area at all, and that I shouldn't wait on family politics if the medication situation was truly unmonitored. I told her I'd be filing formally within the week. I sat in that parking lot a long time afterward, watching moths circle the overhead lights, thinking about exactly how this would read back at the main house. Not as a healthcare professional doing what her license required. As the daughter who'd already been declared dead, now calling the government down on the family that buried her. I started the car anyway. My hands were steady. There's something clarifying about finally having a job that's actually yours to do. The following Tuesday night at my own kitchen table, I filed the report. Clean digital fields, drop-down menus, a checkbox certifying everything was true to my knowledge. I attached the photographs. I listed every medication, every date, every fall, the improvised bandaging, the 14-month gap since her last blood test. I typed my own name, my license number, and my relationship to the vulnerable adult in question. Granddaughter. The cursor sat blinking on that word for a long moment before I hit submit and received a case number. I did something then I'd been doing professionally for other people's emergencies my entire career, without ever once doing it for my own family. I started a folder, plain manila, and on the tab I wrote, in block letters, Ruth, Rosalind, no, forgive me, Harold, called that same week with an update. Formal notice had gone out earlier that Monday to my father. My mother's original announcement at that dinner table now had legal paperwork attached to it. There was going to be another family meeting, and this one Harold needed me to attend as a witness. I met Harold 2 days later at a coffee shop off the highway, somewhere no one in my family would recognize. He brought the financial picture I'd asked for. If the business was a patient, I wanted the full chart. It was worse than I'd guessed. Bennett Marine owed the bank a little over $280,000 in accumulated operating debt, restructured more than once. 2 of the last 5 seasons had been brutal for boat sales. There were liens against equipment. And the retail side of the business that everyone assumed was pure profit had actually been servicing interest payments since before the pandemic even started. He's not a thief, Harold said. Entirely fair about it. He's a proud man running a struggling business in a hard decade who will not, under any circumstance, let anyone see the real numbers. Your mother understood that about him better than anyone alive. What the numbers didn't explain was how an operation that deep in debt, even paying reduced rent, hadn't already collapsed years earlier. Your mother's instructions, Harold said, when I asked him directly how the business had kept breathing. The trust quietly covered the operating loan payments during both hail-damaged seasons, rather than let the bank force liquidation. Every year the numbers didn't close, the gap got covered from the other side of the ledger. Not by the bank. By instruction of Eleanor Bennett, written before she passed. Keep the business breathing. Keep his standing in this town intact. And never once tell him where the support was coming from. Unless, Harold added, letting the words sit. Unless what? I asked. Unless he ever used this family as a weapon against one of his own children again. Publicly. The way he did the night of your mother's funeral reception. Your mother wrote that exact condition into the trust herself. He met that condition again this past Thursday, at your Thanksgiving table. In front of 22 witnesses. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday. At the marina's main office, and Harold's final instruction to me was simple. Say nothing unless directly asked. Sit somewhere you can see the door. And remember that everything discussed in that room, except the people themselves, already legally belongs to the trust. Saturday arrived gray and cold. I parked outside the marina lot and walked in past the boats already pulled for winter storage. Inside the main office, folding chairs had been set up around a long table. My father stood at the head of the room exactly the way he always had, tall, composed, clearly prepared for whatever he assumed was coming. He went first. Of course he went first. He told the assembled family, Mark, Kayla, my aunts, that he'd hoped to spare everyone this conversation after my mother passed. That certain arrangements had apparently been made around the family property by people outside the immediate family. And that he'd carried that burden quietly for 6 years specifically to protect them all from the ugliness of it. But now, he said, the ugliness had arrived uninvited in a black sedan. And its timing was suspicious at best. He looked directly at me. Ask yourselves, he said, why the daughter who abandoned this family shows up the same week the lawyers do. Ask what she signed, and with whom. Ask who called the county on her own grandmother. Gasps around the table. He'd clearly rehearsed this. I said nothing because Harold had told me not to. And because I was watching the one thing in that room my father couldn't manage. Harold Weiss. Unfolding his reading glasses without any hurry at all. Thank you, Richard, Harold said, as pleasant as if he'd just been introduced at a luncheon. I'll take questions when I'm finished, and I won't take long because none of this is actually complicated. It's simply been kept from you. Harold read the quiet facts in a quiet voice and let the facts themselves do all the shouting. The land under this office, he said, all 3 marina properties, has been Bennett family land through Eleanor's side since before Richard ever set foot on it. It passed to Eleanor from her own father. It never once passed to Richard. 6 years ago, Eleanor placed every acre of it into an irrevocable trust and asked me to hold it. Since her death, this entire operation has run on a lease from that trust. He let the word sit in the air. Lease. I watched it travel around that table like a live wire. And I watched exactly when it reached my brother. Mark's head came up slowly. We're renting our own dirt, he said quietly, and his voice cracked in the middle. 20 years I've put my back into this place. And we're tenants. And you knew. My father didn't look at his son. He kept his eyes fixed on Harold with the flat, measured calm of a man counting a storm's distance by the seconds between lightning and thunder. Family business gets handled by the head of the family, he said. That's how it's always been done. Harold glanced up over his glasses with mild, terrible courtesy. Yes, he said. That's exactly what Eleanor thought you'd say. Harold laid out the terms into the silence that followed. The way sentences get read aloud in a courtroom level, without any triumph. Each clause its own small door quietly closing. As of this week's formal notice, he said, Richard Bennett is removed as a permissible beneficiary of the Bennett Family Trust. Pursuant to the exact powers Eleanor wrote into the instrument herself. Removed entirely and permanently from any distribution, from succession, from any interest in any part of this property. The word from Thanksgiving night. Now with legal paperwork attached. Second, the current lease to Bennett Marine will not renew under its existing terms. He named the actual rent the business had been paying. Out loud, in dollars, and the room made a sound like old wood settling. Because everyone at that table carried debt of their own, and everyone present could do the arithmetic. Market rate, or vacate the facilities within 90 days. Third, Harold continued, Ruth Bennett's cottage and its surrounding acre are withdrawn from any lease arrangement, effective immediately. No one leases that home out from under her. No one decides her fate in a family meeting. It belongs solely to the trust. And the trust has been made fully aware of certain recent plans for its occupant. He didn't specify what those plans were. He didn't need to. I watched the back of my father's neck understand in real time. Exactly how much Harold already knew. Aunt Diane's husband asked the reasonable question. The one I'd asked Harold myself in that coffee shop off the highway. If the rent had genuinely been reduced, fine. But reduced rent alone doesn't keep a business that deep in debt alive for 6 straight years. Something didn't add up. Harold took off his glasses, folded them, and set down the final piece. You're right, he said. It doesn't add up. because it was never designed to add up on its own. It was designed to be quietly carried. For 6 years, the trust absorbed what this operation genuinely couldn't cover. During both hail damage seasons, the trust covered the bank payments directly, rather than allow foreclosure. Every season the numbers came up short. That gap was closed from the other side of the table. Not by the bank. Not by Richard's management. By written instruction from Eleanor Bennett, made before she died. Keep the business breathing. Keep his reputation in this town intact. And never once let him know where the support was actually coming from. He looked directly at my father. Your kingdom has run on a dead woman's kindness for 6 years, Richard, Harold said. As of this morning, it's run out. Nobody in that room moved. My father stood up slowly, buttoned his jacket, and I felt the entire room tilt slightly, because that was not the posture of a beaten man. That was the posture of a man reaching for the last piece still available on the board. Fine, my father said, pleasant as a foreclosure notice. If the trust owns the dirt, the trust can own everything standing on it. He turned toward the ants, and I watched him do to my grandmother exactly what he'd done to me for 6 years, turn a living person into a manageable story. Ruth was failing, he said, confused. He'd been quietly carrying her care alone all this time. And now the county was suddenly involved, strangers going through her cabinets. And did everyone understand who had actually caused that? He pointed at me for the second time in 8 days. There are people from the government coming to my mother-in-law's house because of her, he said. So it's finished. If the trust wants that cottage so badly, the trust can have its bills too. No more groceries from my kitchen. No more rides to appointments. Whoever wants to take care of the old woman can take care of the old woman. He said this in front of his own son, his sisters-in-law. In front of everyone. My brother caught me on my way out to the parking lot. 41 years old and looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. Which I'd learned later was roughly accurate. Market rent on top of nearly $300,000 in existing debt is a dead business walking. Claire, he said, working the brim of his cap in both hands. 90 days lands us right in the middle of our winter storage season. The crew's got families. My wife's already asking what county we'll even be living in by spring. He wasn't asking me to fix anything. That's the part that actually broke something loose in me. He was simply reporting it, the way you'd report the weather to whoever happened to be standing next to you. I did everything right, he said quietly. Worked right, married right, kept my mouth shut right. 20 years of doing everything correctly, and today I find out I'm a tenant on my own mother's land. Same as you found out you were mailing letters straight into a shirt pocket. I told him I was sorry, and I genuinely meant it for him, for his wife, for the crew who depended on that business. My brother nodded once, put his cap back on, and walked back into the building that was never actually going to be his either. The following Tuesday, a certified letter arrived addressed to me from the state licensing board. A complaint had been filed regarding my professional conduct, and a formal review was being opened. I stood in my kitchen and read through the categories with my coat still on. Practicing outside my scope. Exploitation of a vulnerable adult for financial gain. Undue influence over an elderly relative. Anyone can file a complaint like that. It costs nothing and requires no actual proof to open an investigation. And while it remains open, it sits on your professional license like a permanent stain. He couldn't reach the land anymore, so he reached for my career instead. The thing I'd built with night shifts and unpaid overtime. The one inheritance I'd ever actually earned with my own 2 hands. I hired a lawyer in my own county, a careful, unhurried man named Foster who'd once helped me untangle a lease dispute years earlier. I handed him everything. The board complaint. The case number from the county, the photographs, the medication list. My grandmother's doctor's documented capacity assessment. The notarized permission she'd later give me for her care decisions. He went through every page methodically, like a man checking a fence line for weak posts. Boards don't discipline healthcare workers for mandated reports that check out, Claire, he finally said. They discipline the ones who fail to file. You did every single part of this in the correct order. Meanwhile, A county caseworker did her home visit at last. My father let her in, because his own lawyer had clearly explained what obstructing a state investigation could cost him. And he stood in my grandmother's kitchen radiating full cooperation while Ruth, capacity fully documented, told the state the truth with her hands folded neatly in her lap. He performed for that visit beautifully. Carried groceries up the porch steps in plain view the day before. Personally laid out her pills each morning in a small dish. Because no county worker was ever going to say Richard Bennett had neglected his own family. Hold on to that detail. Because a man who has spent his entire life believing management equals care was about to have that theory tested by his own mother-in-law's blood work. 2 weeks after that family meeting, I got a call from Harold. It was time, he said, for the letter my mother had written specifically for me. He met me at his office downtown, closed the door, and left me alone with a cream-colored envelope. My name written across it in my mother's own hand. I'll share what I can bear to share. She had written it 3 weeks before she died. The handwriting was tired but unmistakably hers. She wrote that if Harold had followed the sequence correctly. I was reading this after my father had sent me away in front of the whole family. At the moment he judged the audience to be largest. She wrote that she had watched the pattern of that house her entire marriage and understood it far too late to protect me from it. Love kept like a ledger. Entered and debated until every single person in that family became a debt owed to someone else. She wrote that she had lacked the courage to break that ledger while she was alive. She had done, instead, the only thing a quiet woman with her name still on the land could do. She built a door he could never wall shut, and placed the key in the hands of the one person he could never manage or outlast. And then the lines. I have now read more times than I can count. The paper gone soft at every fold. They will tell you leaving was your failure, Claire. Leaving was the first genuinely wise decision this family made in 3 generations. Your hands were never meant to be the rent you owed anyone. At the very bottom, a small postscript, almost shy. There is one more envelope. It's his. Harold will know when the day comes. I sat alone in that office a long time with both hands flat on the desk, studying nothing in particular. Then Harold came back in, carrying one more folder. And behind his glasses he had the look of a man finishing a final task for an old friend. Now, he said, let's talk about what's actually yours. What was mine turned out to be a decision with 2 very different paths in front of it. My mother had left the remainder of the trust to be directed according to Harold's judgment, with a written note expressing her hope that when this day arrived, my judgment would take over. Harold told me plainly that he was tired. I'm 68, Claire, he said. I've carried this for 6 years and promised her I'd hold it until the condition finally tripped. It's tripped. It's yours if you want it. He slid a drafted document across the table. Full direction over the entire trust, every acre, every building. All succession decisions, under my sole authority. With Harold staying on only long enough to transition me in. You're the only one she'd trust with all of it, Harold said. And after everything he's put you through. The board complaint, the calls to your employer. No one alive would blame you for taking every bit of it. And here is my confession. The entire reason I'm telling you any of this tonight. I wanted it. Every part of me wanted it. I sat in that office and felt the full weight of it settle into my hands like it had been custom built for me. And it fit perfectly. And that perfect fit was exactly what terrified me. I pictured every future holiday with me at the head of that table, deciding who got served first. I pictured my father's face the day the marina got sold out from under him entirely. It played out beautifully in my head. It always plays out beautifully. That's precisely how the ledger finds its next bookkeeper. I looked at my mother's letter, still open on the desk beside me, and I asked Harold for 1 week to think it over. He studied me for a long moment, and something that looked almost like relief crossed his face, like he'd been quietly hoping I'd hesitate exactly this way. My father came to see me 4 days later. I want you to picture this clearly because I still do. My father, 66 years old, drove 3 hours to my apartment and stood on my front porch holding his good hat in both hands. The man had never once visited me in my own home before. Doing so would have required admitting I actually lived somewhere, I didn't invite him inside. We stood with the screen door between us like some kind of confessional booth. And my father offered me the deal he'd clearly built inside his own head. "Come home," he said. And his voice, I have to be honest about this, wasn't cruel. It was the voice from years earlier, from before all of this, and it knew exactly what it was doing to me. "Thanksgiving," he said. "Your room's still your room." Nobody says another word about any of it, the county, the paperwork. We put it all down to grief and moving forward. Family holds together, Claire. He came within one sentence of sounding genuinely gracious. Then he finished it, because he always finishes it that way. "All you have to do," he said, "is tell that lawyer to renew the lease exactly as it stood. That's all. One sentence from you, and you're my daughter again." There it was, priced out plainly. A seat back at the table, at market rate. I told him I'd give him my answer by Friday. He put his hat back on, satisfied, a man who had genuinely never once heard the word no coming from me, and drove off in his truck. My phone was already buzzing in my back pocket before his taillights cleared the block. "Kayla, 3 missed calls." Then a text that turned my whole porch to ice under my feet. "Grandma's at County General. A nosebleed that won't stop. Claire, he's been managing her pills himself and he doubled the dose. The drive to that hospital normally takes 3 hours. I made it in closer to 2. By the time I arrived, they had my grandmother stable. I want to be careful and honest here, because this channel doesn't traffic in soap opera medical drama. A nosebleed that won't stop on its own isn't dramatic television. But on a mismanaged blood thinner, it is absolutely a fire alarm. Her blood work came back exactly as wrong as I'd feared. Thinned far past any safe range. The kind of number that makes an emergency room doctor ask, in a voice you could genuinely frost glass with, who had been managing this woman's medication. They gave her vitamin K, kept her overnight for observation, and monitored for internal bleeding they couldn't see directly. How it happened was almost painfully ordinary. Her consolidated pharmacy had adjusted her dosage per her physician's updated instructions. My father, laying out her pills each morning in that little dish like the responsible manager he believed himself to be, had simply kept giving her the old dose on top of the new bottle schedule. No written chart. No cross-check. Because asking questions is for men who don't already believe they know everything. My grandmother was propped up on pillows. When they finally let me back to see her, cotton stuffed up one nostril, and she looked at me and rasped, "Tell them I'm not finished yet. Your father will try to bill me for the flowers." 86 years old, thin as paper, still the sharpest wit in the county. I laughed so I wouldn't do the other thing instead. A charge nurse asked quietly in the hallway who held decision-making authority if it came to that. I heard myself answer without hesitation. "I do. I'm her healthcare agent. Here's the documentation." And it stopped being paper in a folder in that instant. It became the actual weight of a real human life, placed directly into the hands of the exact person my father had declared dead, less than 3 weeks earlier, down near the elevators. A caseworker from the county stood writing quietly in a notebook. Hospitals, it turns out, file their own reports. Things moved quickly after that. The way institutions tend to move once they stop waiting for a family's permission to see a situation clearly. The hospital's report landed on top of mine. My grandmother's physician's own records landed on top of both. Within days, the county's office issued its formal finding, in that flat bureaucratic language state agencies always use. Allegation substantiated. Neglect confirmed. A mandated care plan issued for Ruth Bennett, professional home care required. Medication management strictly by licensed hands only. No exceptions. I read that finding standing alone in my kitchen and put my palm flat against the Ruth folder sitting on my counter. The way you'd rest a hand on a good dog that had finally found what it was searching for. Every photograph, every date, every properly filed piece of paper in that folder was now doing real, load-bearing work. Foster called almost cheerful with the update. The board complaint against my license was collapsing under the weight of a substantiated state finding and my own thorough documentation. "These things end," he said, in a letter with the word unfounded printed on it. Bureaucracy just takes its own sweet season getting there. The paperwork had held. But a mandated care plan needs a real address behind it. And that's where every single road in this story bent back to one long table. My grandmother's cottage needed repairs. A living care schedule needed real funding. And Ruth's entire personal estate amounted to a modest Social Security check and her wedding ring. The trust could fund all of it, indefinitely, without even noticing the expense. And who directed the trust going forward would be either me, or the version of me holding my father's old whip. Harold called that same evening and didn't waste a single word. 2 signature blocks drafted both ways, Claire. Friday, my office, all relevant parties present. I've already asked your father and Mark to attend. Both of them? I asked. Whatever you decide to become, Harold said. Be it to their actual faces. I hung up and looked at my kitchen table where 3 objects sat waiting for me. The folder. My mother's letter. The small tin of returned letters. My entire case, my entire argument, my entire family, reduced to paper. I didn't sleep much that Thursday night, and I'm not sorry about that. Some nights are simply built for arithmetic. I laid all 3 items out in a row and made myself read back over 6 years of my own October letters. Light and careful. I'm fine, Grandma, I'm fine. And finally heard them for exactly what they'd actually been. 6 years of quiet payments made toward a family membership that had already been formally revoked. My father had kept his ledger and his pencil at the head of a dinner table. I had kept mine in postage stamps. Same book. Same disease. Just managed more politely. And the stack of papers waiting for me at Harold's office was that same book again, just with a promotion attached. Head bookkeeper. I thought about my mother, who I had believed for 6 years had died quiet and bullied, and who had actually spent her final weeks constructing a fire door with her own steady signing hand. She hadn't used her inheritance to punish my father. She could have done that at literally any point across 38 years of marriage. She'd used it exactly once, for exactly one purpose. To guarantee that the day he weaponized this family against her daughter again, that weapon would come apart entirely in his own hands. Not a whip, a door. There's a real difference between the two, and sitting at that kitchen table at 4 a.m, I finally found the edge of it with both hands. So I did what she would have done. I took a legal pad and drafted my own terms. My terms, 1 clean page, plain enough to read aloud to a room that had already convicted me once already. By the time the sun came up, I had my 1 page. It was my mother's arithmetic, not my father's. And when Friday finally arrived, I drove to Harold's office to spend it, every single line. In front of all of them, Harold's conference room holds a long table, 8 chairs, and nothing decorative on the walls except a framed print of the county courthouse, which felt either like humility or a warning. Depending entirely on your mood that Friday morning. By 10 o'clock, everyone was seated. Harold at the head of the table with his own attorney beside him. Foster at my elbow. My father across from me in his good church jacket, certain of how this would go. My brother beside him, gray around the mouth. A man 90 days from watching his entire livelihood get auctioned off. My father was courteous. That's actually what I remember most clearly. How courteous he was. Because he believed one of exactly 2 things was about to happen. Either I'd taken his porch step deal and the lease was about to quietly renew, or I'd taken full control of the trust, in which case he was fully prepared to be wronged magnificently in front of witnesses. You could see the speech folded up and waiting in his breast pocket. Either outcome fit neatly inside the world he understood. In the first, the family holds together. In the second, I had simply become him. And the same code survived even in his own exile. What he was not built for. What that entire room, that whole family bloodline, had absolutely no space prepared for. Was a third option. Harold opened the folder and I saw the 2 drafted signature blocks Foster had described to me earlier. The entire future of that property cocked and ready like a hammer. He looked at me, and there was no push whatsoever in his expression, which I will genuinely be grateful for as long as I live. Claire, he said. The trust is prepared to proceed however you direct it. How do you want to direct it? I took out my 1 page. My father settled back into his chair, arms crossing, already braced for whichever whip he'd expected. I unfolded my page, smoothed out the crease, and read the first line aloud to the entire room. I decline. I read. Any appointment, ownership, or control over the Bennett family trust. Now and permanently. The room made no sound at all, which in my family is the actual sound of genuine shock. My brother's head lifted. Harold's own attorney glanced up over his glasses. My father blinked once, slowly, the blink of a man whose entire prepared script had just vanished off the page in front of him. I kept reading before anyone could find their footing again. Because I'd built this page in the exact order a nurse builds a treatment plan. Most urgent first. The trust would establish, funded from my own directed share, an endowment with exactly one job. The old boat storage building at the smallest marina location, the one facility that had never actually turned a real profit, would be converted and licensed as an adult day program and home care support hub for elderly residents across the county. Transportation for those who could no longer drive themselves. Nursing visits for the ones nobody else was checking on. Real seed funding, in partnership with the county agency I'd already spoken with twice. Its name, right there on the page in block letters. The Eleanor Bennett Center. I heard Harold's own breath change slightly. The only tell that man surrendered all day. Second, my grandmother's cottage. Permanent occupancy rights for Ruth, for life. Full repairs funded, and a complete care plan paid entirely by the trust. Professional aides, proper medication management, every county compliance requirement met, and then some. Kayla, hired as her paid care coordinator. Because the person who sent up the original flare should be the one running the lighthouse now. And me, at that cottage every single week, as her granddaughter and as her nurse. Written into the actual care chart where no shirt pocket could ever misplace me again. My father finally found his voice. And it came out rough, scraped raw. This is her land. Our family's land. And you're just handing it to strangers. Old strangers. I looked at him for the first time since that Thanksgiving dinner. You held this family, Dad, I said, keeping my voice at the level I use for 2 a.m. hospital calls. You held it and held it and held it. Held things eventually break. Tended things grow. Mom understood that difference. It's the entire reason you were never anything but a tenant. 3 signatures remained on that table after that, and each one cost more than the one before it. The first one spent genuine mercy on my brother. Read aloud so Mark heard every single term arrive directly from my mouth. The trust would offer Bennett Marine a new lease at fair market rate. Phased in gradually across 3 full seasons. Long enough to actually restructure the existing debt with the bank instead of feeding it straight into an auction. Full financial transparency required annually. And the lease would run to the operation itself, meaning Mark and his wife's names. With succession rights to their own children someday. If they wanted land that would finally deal with them honestly for once. My brother stared down the length of that table. Jaw working. And what he finally managed to say wasn't thank you. It was, why? Because you stayed and I left, I told him. And it bought us exactly the same nothing in the end. One of us should get to build something different out of it. The second signature governed my father directly. Lifetime tenancy in the main family house, his home for over 40 years. No one pointing him toward any road at any caretaker's rent, for as long as he wanted to stay. But attached to it, flat and permanent as a fence line. No role whatsoever in Ruth's care, medical, financial, or otherwise. No authority at the Eleanor Bennett Center. Not 1 acre, not 1 vote, ever again. A roof, with no kingdom underneath it. He didn't sign anything in that moment, because his signature wasn't actually required for any of it. And watching him truly understand that nothing left in that room actually needed him anymore, was the closest I came all day to looking away. The third signature was mine. A full waiver, drafted at my own instruction, permanently renouncing any personal claim, present or future, against the trust or its land. The house I grew up in. My mother's kitchen. Her garden by the back door. Whatever version of the girl who'd once lived there was still waiting quietly to be summoned home. I understood the finality of that, I told Foster. When he asked formally if I understood exactly what I was signing away, I dated it, capped the pen, and it was done. My father caught me alone on the courthouse steps outside, hat back in his hands. And for the very first time in my entire life, he looked to me like what he also genuinely was, an old man standing in a county square that had spent the last 2 weeks quietly discussing him over breakfast. "You think I'm a monster," he said. "I'm not sorry, and I want that clearly noted. Not sorry, to his very last syllable." But then he looked past me, out at nothing in particular, at that middle distance where men like him keep everything stored away, and he told me the only story from his own childhood I have ever once heard him tell. His father and his own uncle had split a piece of land decades ago in a bad year, and there had been words exchanged. And his father had never spoken that brother's name again for the rest of his life, made the entire family unspeak it. At every birthday and every funeral, both. "A family holds together," my father started. "Because one hand," and he stopped right there mid-sentence. His own lifelong proverb coming completely apart in his own mouth. He stood on those steps, unable to finish it, working the brim of his hat. And I watched something that looked genuinely like fear looking out from a face I'd only ever seen as granite before. That didn't excuse a single moment of what happened at that Thanksgiving table. Both things get to be true at once. And that might be the hardest sentence in this entire story. Behind us, the office door opened. Harold came down the steps and held out a second cream-colored envelope, twin to mine. My father's name written across it in a dead woman's hand. "She asked me to wait until the day you had absolutely nothing left," Harold said. Leveled to the very end. My father looked at that envelope for a long, long moment. Then he took it, slid it directly into his coat pocket unopened, and said only, "Tell your grandmother the groceries stop coming Monday." And he walked to his truck through the thin winter sun. As far as I know to this day, that seal has never once been broken. He built himself one final room he refuses to ever enter, and my mother's actual voice is waiting quietly inside it. I drove home with the window cracked, cold air clearing the whole courthouse off me. And somewhere past the county line, I finally understood what had actually changed hands in that room, and it wasn't property. For 6 years I had been waiting. Underneath the work, underneath the letters, underneath all that overfunctioning, for someone up north to revise my file, reopen my case, and decide I'd finally been useful enough, good enough, competent enough to be reinstated as a daughter again. That waiting had been the very last thing my father still held over me. And he'd held it without even realizing it. The exact same way he'd held my grandmother's letters in his shirt pocket for years. It ended right there on those steps. I watched an old man choose an unopened envelope over his own late wife's final words. And something in me quietly closed its account. Not out of anger. Anger is just the ledger flipped upside down. It closed the way a long shift finally ends. Documented, handed off, done. Winter went straight to the contractors after that. The old storage building got proper insulation, a wheelchair ramp, wide doorways, a working kitchen that could turn out soup for 30 people at once, and a long wall of windows facing the water. Because if you're going to sit somewhere in your final decades, you should get to sit somewhere something is actually alive. My grandmother was home by the following Thanksgiving. New furnace in her cottage, new porch boards, aides morning and evening. Her blood work checked on a strict schedule, taped right inside the medicine cabinet where anyone could read it. Nothing hidden in that house anymore. Not even the pills. I was there every single week, exactly as promised on the actual chart this time. We read through 6 years of unanswered letters out loud together. One per visit, her reading hers, me reciting mine from memory. Both of us editing ourselves shamelessly along the way. The Eleanor Bennett Center opened that spring with 14 numbers, which the county coordinator called a strong start, and my grandmother called a decent turnout. They arrived in vans and in their grandchildren's trucks. A retired schoolteacher who hadn't shared a lunch table with another person in nearly 4 years. 2 widowed farmers who discovered they genuinely disliked each other's fathers decades earlier and became inseparable within a month. My grandmother installed herself permanently at the head table and announced she was quality control. Nobody has ever successfully voted her out of that position, And my father, he's still there. In the main house, under his lifetime tenancy. He runs nothing now. Mark runs the marina, and the books go to the trust every autumn. Fully audited and fully transparent, and the business is slowly climbing back out of its hole, one honest season at a time. Slower than a miracle. Sturdier than 1-2. My father has never once set foot inside the Eleanor Bennett Center. I'm told he tells his own version of this story at the diner in town. The daughter who brought in lawyers. The wife who went behind his back. The county that meddled where it didn't belong. And some people still nod along. I've made a full and final peace with that. Leaving that family was never actually my failure. It turned out to be the very first thing I ever did that my mother, rest her, would have genuinely called an inheritance. And it's the one thing of hers I'd pass along to anyone still standing quietly at a gate they keep hoping will eventually open on its own. Some doors you simply stop knocking on. Some doors you build yourself, if you've ever had to walk away from a table just to keep your own dignity intact. This channel is your porch light tonight. Tell me in the comments what door you finally stopped knocking on. And if this story found you tonight, subscribe to Calm Drama Vault. Because there's always another quiet daughter still standing at a gate, waiting for someone to finally tell her the truth. I'm Claire. Thanks for staying until the end of the drive.